Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to discuss another manifesto, Donna Haraway's 1985 Cyborg Manifesto. Here, Haraway highlights the shortcomings of classical feminism by reconceptualizing questions of gender and identity in the context of technology. She uses the cyborg, a hybrid of machine and organism, as a metaphor to explore the blurring of boundaries between human and machine, nature and culture, and the physical and non-physical. The goal of the text, which Haraway admits is a utopian one, is to imagine a world without fixed categories like race and gender. I should start out by saying that in feminism, you can think of gender as being the set of social expectations that are ascribed to male or female bodies. These things have been known to change over time and across different cultures. So, in the feminist view, gender is taken as something which is socially constructed. It's not some kind of denial of the fact that some people have breasts and other people don't. Rather, it's just a denial of the idea that one's physical body naturally implies the role they should have in society. Haraway was born on September 6, 1944, in Denver, Colorado. Unusual for the scholars that we cover in this series, Haraway earned a PhD in biology at Yale in 1972. Later, however, Haraway shifted her academic focus towards the philosophy of science. Today, she's a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, but I think she's mostly enjoying her retirement at this point. Donna Haraway's manifesto was first published in 1985. In many ways, it is a product of its era. One of the prominent aspects of this time was the rapid development in technology, especially in the field of information technology. The introduction of personal computers and the early stages of the internet were changing the way that many people thought about their relationship to technology. Socially, the era was marked by significant developments in the feminist movement. Second-wave feminism in the 1960s and 1970s sought to go beyond the legal rights secured by the suffragettes in the first wave. The second-wave feminists brought attention to a range of topics and issues that had not been addressed by first-wave feminists, including sexuality, the role of women in the family and the workplace, and reproductive rights. By the 1980s, however, the feminist movement was grappling with critiques from within about the need to recognize diversity among women. Historically, feminism had typically been represented by the experiences of middle and upper-class white women. This led to the rise of third-wave feminism and intersectionality, which complicated views of womanhood by considering how race, class, and sexuality intersect with gender. Haraway's work can be seen as a response to these feminist debates. Our first order of business when reading texts like these should be to get our definitions straight. What does Haraway mean when she talks about cyborgs? Instinctually, you might be thinking something along the lines of RoboCop or the Terminator. But Haraway means something else entirely. The concept of the cyborg comes from the field of cybernetics. Cybernetics is an approach to sociology which views society and social organizations as complex systems with interconnected parts which regulate, communicate, and balance each other. For Haraway, to call somebody a cyborg is simply to recognize their positionality and sublimation into and within a broader system of ideas, technologies, and institutions which regulate social life. In her words, Haraway defines a cyborg as a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality, as well as a creature of fiction. If you're anything like me, this definition didn't help you very much, so let's keep digging. For Haraway, the cyborg is a boundary-transgressing figure, one that exists where human and machine, nature and culture, and the physical and non-physical intersect. The metaphor of the cyborg rejects the notion that humans and machines, or nature and culture, are fundamentally separate and distinct. Instead, Haraway posits that these categories are intertwined and, in fact, mutually defining. In her view, we are all cyborgs of some form or another. Consider, for example, the panic you feel when you leave the movie theater and notice your cell phone is no longer in your pocket. Haraway might say that this feeling is proof of our cybernetic integration. So, the cyborg for Haraway isn't a literal fusion of human and machine, like the Terminator, but rather a symbolic, almost literary figure, one that helps us acknowledge the extent to which the modern individual is dependent upon and defined by the information networks to which they are increasingly bound. The modern cyborg, for Haraway, emerges at the intersection of what she calls the three major social and technological boundary breakdowns of the late 20th century. The first is the breakdown between human and animal. The line between humans and animals has been crossed by various forms of biotechnology, and the theory of evolution has blurred the distinction between what is human and what is animal. Haraway cites animal rights movements as evidence of this shift in our popular concept of animality. As she put it, movements for animal rights are not irrational denials of human uniqueness. They are clear-sighted recognition of connection across the discredited breach of nature and culture. Biology and evolutionary theory have simultaneously produced modern organisms as objects of knowledge and reduced the line between humans and animals to a faint trace, re-etched in ideological struggle or professional disputes between the life and social sciences. The second is the boundary breakdown between human and machine. As you might have guessed, this breakdown refers to the blurring lines between organisms and machines. With the advent of cybernetics and other technologies, living organisms can be seen as information systems or biotic components. For example, we know that a single DNA molecule can store 215 million gigabytes of information. Meanwhile, on the other end of things, machines themselves are increasingly taking on lifelike qualities, such as learning and self-replication. This seems even more obvious today with the recent boom in AI and machine learning. All of this challenges the old conceptual dichotomy of natural versus artificial. For Haraway, the cyborg is the emblem of this breakdown. The third and final boundary breakdown Haraway identifies is the breakdown between the physical and non-physical. Advancements in technology, particularly in terms of digital and information technologies, have significantly blurred this boundary. We live in a reality that is continuously and increasingly mediated by digital technologies. We interact in virtual spaces, form communities online, create and experience digital representations of ourselves, and even perform significant aspects of our work and social lives in digital environments. This became increasingly true during the pandemic, when everyone was remote working on Zoom. Information, once bound to physical mediums, now seems to float freely and can be accessed from anywhere, creating a new form of reality that is not strictly physical, but is nonetheless influential and real, especially with respect to our material lives. Haraway's work was also in some ways a response to the writings of Karl Marx. In her section on the informatics of domination, Haraway attempts to move beyond Marx's materialism by vaguely foreshadowing the rise of the information economy. In her words, human beings, like any other component or subsystem, must now be localized in a system architecture whose basic modes of operation are probabilistic. No objects, spaces, or bodies are sacred in themselves. Any component can be interfaced with any other if the proper standard, the proper code, can be constructed for processing signals in a common language. In other words, Haraway believed that in the post-industrial era, the human subject would be dominated primarily through their translation and quantification into probability and statistics, rather than merely their relation to the means of production. The data-driven approach to humanity becomes a new basis for power and control. Now that we understand what a cyborg is, we can start to read Haraway's manifesto as a reaction to what she saw as some of the problems of feminism. Haraway criticized the oversimplification and totalizing tendencies of certain forms of feminism, particularly socialist and radical feminism. Haraway was suspicious of what she saw as a tendency for feminists to rely on identity politics, or the approach to politics and knowledge based on identification with single identity categories like race, gender, and sexuality. She contended that such approaches could be exclusionary, as they imply boundaries between who is and isn't included in the movement. One good example of this could be trans-exclusionary radical feminists, who don't acknowledge trans women as being part of the feminine experience or as deserving of a voice in feminist movements. For Haraway, this tendency for single identity politics to devolve into boundary setting makes it hard to build a unified feminist movement. Haraway particularly critiques essentialism in feminism, or the idea that all women share a common essence or experience, and instead advocates for an intersectional understanding of identity as multifaceted and constructed. As she put it, there is nothing about being female that naturally binds woman. There is not even such a state as being female, itself a highly complex category, constructed in contested sexual, scientific discourses, and other social practices. Haraway suggested that the experiences of women of color in colonized nations could align with her cyborg concept, as they represent a form of subjectivity synthesized from fusions of different outsider identities. I think Haraway is attempting to highlight the often simplified and monolithic representations of women of color that were prominent within some of the feminist discourses of her time. For Haraway, these women align with the cyborg metaphor in the sense that they are at the unique intersection of marginalized native perspectives, as well as the dominant social narratives of the colonial nations which have imposed their way of life and thinking. Anyway, if nothing else, Haraway's discussion of the cyborg in relation to colonialism reminds us that the cyborg metaphor isn't necessarily really about technology. It's more about recognizing one's position with respect to an information landscape of vague and collapsing identity boundaries, boundaries that Haraway believes are no longer legitimate. Now, if you're like me, you might be thinking, well, what's the point? What is the cyborg good for? Donna Haraway saw the metaphor of the cyborg as a way to challenge and resist patriarchy, colonialism, and essentialism, each of which, in her opinion, are sustained through the rigorous setting and maintenance of boundaries and categories. For example, the patriarchal system is founded upon the idea that there are two categories, men and women, and that the border between these categories should not and cannot be trespassed. As for essentialism, this is the belief that certain categories of people, like men, women, or the distinctions between different races, have innate and unchangeable essences, ones that they naturally inherit genetically or socially. The cyborg, however, is a creature of constructed identity. It's a challenge to the idea that identity must be fixed, singular, or inherited. It would be hard to have a sexist society if nobody had any concept of a woman. The cyborg is between any given category. It is more than a woman. It's more than a white person or a black person. These identities can inform the cyborg, but they do not fundamentally constitute it. For this reason, Haraway's manifesto is considered a landmark work in transhumanism. Transhumanists argue that humanity can and should enter a post-human stage, where we transcend our biological limitations through advancements in fields such as genetic engineering, robotics, AI, and nanotechnology. This could include modifying and controlling our sexual biology. Haraway believes that the feminist movement is more likely to succeed in its political goals if feminists can begin to see themselves as cyborg feminists, unified by flexibility and agentic adaptability, instead of using fixed or inherent identity categories to draw boundaries between themselves and others. Of course, like all popular manifestos, Donna Haraway's proved to be controversial from the outset. In the Cyborg Manifesto, Haraway is basically making a case for a new form of feminist subjectivity. In other words, she wants to challenge the way that women think about themselves in relation to society. Haraway insists that the cyborg metaphor is a powerful one, capable of challenging patriarchy and colonialism. But she doesn't really explain how she expects this to happen. To the most cynical reader, it might at times feel like somebody saying, well, maybe the world wouldn't be so messed up if everybody just thought about things differently. We might have logically and rhetorically countered the essentialist logic, but that doesn't mean it won't continue to be applied to us in society. Also, a lot of people just don't want to shed their gender or racial identities. Some feminists have even called the manifesto anti-feminist because it denies any commonalities of the female experience, essentially undermining one of the defining characteristics of traditional feminism. In addition, some have argued that Haraway's focus on the blurring of boundaries and the destabilization of categories like human and machine, and physical and non-physical, can lead to an underemphasis on the importance of the physical, embodied experience. I think this comes across in her discussion of colonialism. It can feel overly intellectual and borderline problematic, even if it was obviously well-intentioned. Finally, in my opinion, this work just isn't very accessible. Some of the language used here is really so confusing. The introduction, for example, is so baffling and unnecessarily semantic. This was a hard video to make. And I'm of the personal opinion that academics should write for everybody. Haraway doesn't do that in her manifesto, but it's hard to believe that she couldn't if she wanted to. In any case, this is certainly a provocative read, if a bit of a head-scratcher, and I think we should expect it to remain relevant with the growing interest in the transhumanist movement, as well as all these new conversations about gender. I hope you guys learned something, and I will see you in the next video.